Welcome to the Witchy Work Wishes podcast, a place to find your weekly inspiration for bringing your personal witchcraft practice into your business, work, and office. Welcome to Witchy Work Wishes. Thank you so much for joining me today and being here. I'm your host, Charlene, and today's episode is all about shadow work, which I believe is a really good way to wrap up the 2023 year so we know what needs to be a part of our 2024 goals. And of course, we are going to be tackling that and making and creating our list in next week's episode. First, I usually do like to share some things I did over the weekend to help with my own personal practice, but since today's episode is so very important, I did not want to break it up into two separate podcasts. It goes well over an hour, and you guys know I really do try to keep the podcast that I personally create about 30 minutes-ish, so you can listen on, your way in or your way home from work. But today's recording just needs to flow as is. So we have a nice long one today talking about shadow work with my guest, Kristen Ramezzana, the Underworld Queen. I will let you know I tried. I promise. So many times to draft out my notes on what I had pulled for shadow work. And it's because this time last year when I was working on my own personal and business goals, I knew shadow work was going to be a part of my healing process. So, I can get to that next level. This is not an easy subject for me, and I don't take it lightly. Because of that, each time I started to work on what it was, what it means, what the process is, and on and on and on, I stalled. And I'm guessing for good reason. Part of my process to be ready to truly dive in deep with shadow work was going through the baby steps to get me there. And for whatever reason, my health journey focused on my physical body last year more than my emotional and spiritual journey and, the shadow work. So not that I was not doing both in some form or fashion, but I don't think I could have done the shadow work while having two major surgeries these past months and getting my physical being to a healthy level again. I think it's all falling into place as it should be, and I need to trust that. So, back to my start, I promise I really did try. So I was researching, some of the history with it, but draft after draft, I just needed help. And again, I think that's because I'm not taking shadow work lightly. I was thinking, maybe if it's overwhelming for me, it might be for you too. Now, I know I'm ready for it, and I want to make sure I get the best advice on how to start, how to navigate through it, and know when to wave the white flag and ask for professional help. I've always kind of separated the Book of Shadows from a grimoire. I do think this is a bit more interchangeable probably with many practitioners, than it is for me. A grimoire in my practice is where I keep my spell notes, what worked, what didn't, my recipes, my workings, my witchy knowledge. A Book of Shadows, again, just for my practice, is the work, the hard work written down of the very, very personal dark shadows that I need to process and deal with and reconcile to be an emotionally healthy and whole person. Hopefully, so I can move forward and not have to repeat life lessons. The same life lessons next time. So again, one of the things I love most about our practice is that we get to make it ours and sculpt it exactly to fit our own personal needs. Every witch is unique, and every witch will have a slightly different take on things. So for me, I really do separate out those two types of books or journals. My grimoire, and I do have one, has all of my witchy knowledge. My Book of Shadows, which I don't have, I'm just going to be starting, is a personal journal documenting the trauma, the issues, the dark shadows that I need to work through, the good and the bad. So the first thing I looked for is, what is shadow work? And I found it's basically a psychological and spiritual practice that involves exploring and integrating the quote-unquote shadow, better known as our unconscious area of ourselves. This is not a new concept, and you may associate it right away with Carl Jung, although I think it's associated with various psychological theories. So Carl Gustav Jung, born in July of 1875, was a Swiss psychiatrist who introduced the idea of the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. Now, the shadow refers to the hidden repressed, or maybe even, denied aspects of one's personality. For this, think about our qualities, our desires, fears, and our impulses that are not consciously acknowledged. These aspects are not necessarily negative, right? They can encompass both positive and negative traits that we may find difficult to accept or confront. And honestly, I think they can dictate a big portion of our lives without us even knowing where they come from. So shadow work aims to bring these unconscious elements into our conscious awareness, right? With that, we allow room for self-discovery and healing and our own personal growth. Now, if that sounds both scary and amazing, yeah, I feel it too. So in researching and making my own notes for this podcast, which again, I've tried to do over and over and over again during the past year, it was just too much. I put a pause on it, knowing damn well I did not have the knowledge, the tools, or the information to move forward with what I had found. The history is great, and I love having the back history of stuff. But now what? How do you move forward? So my white flag was drawn, and I reached out to Kristen Ramezzana, the underworld queen, for help. She does an amazing job of walking me through what this all is. And honestly, I hope you do find some answers and some guidance and some direction like I did in talking with her. Again, this episode does go over an hour, so if you can budget that during your work week, I promise it is well worth it to listen all the way through. So let's join the taping with Kristen and learn about shadow work. Hello, I am back, and I am so happy to have Kristen here with us as a guest today, who is going to guide us through exactly what shadow work means, how we can start it, and definitely be a helping hand for all of us who need this portion of guidance in our life. So welcome, Kristen.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. And as you know, shadow work is my most favorite thing. It is such a transformational modality. I love talking about it. So I'm honored to be spending time with you and your listeners today.
Thank you so much. And hey, before we get started, can you just list out where people can find you? I'll be sure to include that in my show notes as well. But just so they have, if they want to look you up on Instagram or your website, where can we reach you?
Yeah. So my Instagram, I go by the Underworld Queen. I'm sure the links will be in the comments. There's an underscore under like the and Underworld and then Underworld and Queen. So the Underworld Queen on Instagram, I'm most active there. That's where I post like just so much stuff. I do a lot in my stories. I do a lot of like really fun like sales and things like that. A lot of good information. And then I also have my website, which is just my name, KristenRamezzana.com. And that has like all my programs and all that good stuff.
That is perfect. And for everybody listening, I'll be sure to include all of those links into the show notes for this episode. All right. So, Kristen, I have been trying to do this and start my own journey. And I definitely don't want to make this about me for this episode. I want to make sure it's general enough so everybody can start their own path with it. But I've, as most people, there's been some trauma, that you try to overcome. And sometimes that can be a real life changer for people. And certainly it was for me. After kind of tanking and hitting, I think, my lowest, I came out and truly understood what I thought to be needed in my life, which was the shadow work. And I think that's a real different place to come from. Personally, instead of somebody saying, hey, you need to go to therapy or you need to work on stuff, when you personally want it yourself, I think it can be very, very powerful. I look it up. Kristen, I research things and I just get stuck every time. It is so overwhelming of what shadow work means, where to begin, and how do we incorporate that into our lives. And if you can help with any of that, that would be amazing.
I can help with all of that. Yeah. So the first thing I will say is shadow work is so powerful. And I think that it's become a buzzword now in the spiritual space and even just like in the healing space. And on one hand, I'm so grateful for that because so many people are waking up to how powerful and how healing it really can be and how much it can shift your life. And also, as with anything, when something becomes a buzzword and a hot topic, it gets really watered down and distorted, which is part of the reason why it's so hard to find quality information, because you have people being like, just use these journal prompts. And that's like actually not at all what deep shadow work really is. So we're going to get into that in a moment. But what I can personally speak on in regards to hitting a low and then kind of seeking answers is oftentimes when we are in those rock bottom moments, in those dark nights of the soul, like there's so much that we don't know because our conscious brain is only 5% of our mind. So if we are not diving into the shadow, which is the unconscious mind, we're only using about 5% of our brain. So we're operating with a 95% blind spot, and we wonder why we keep hitting brick walls. And so obviously there's so many incredible healing modalities. I'm a huge fan of therapy. I was in therapy for such a long time and it really helped. But I feel like sometimes we hit these points where what got us here won't get us there. And so, years in therapy can get you so far. But again, if you're not diving into the unconscious, you're really scratching the surface on everything that's in your psyche and everything that's driving your pattern. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is what the shadow is, because we need to understand what it is before we understand how to access it. So we have 3 levels of consciousness. And like I just mentioned, we have our conscious mind, which is 5% of our brain, roughly. And this is like all the shit that we're fully aware of, like, what you chose to wear today. And, like there's so many things that we're fully aware of. And then when we start to bring patterns to the surface and we become aware of those become part of our conscious mind. Then beneath that, we have the subconscious. And this is where most people get stuck when they start to go inwards for spiritual healing, like subconscious reprogramming, such as affirmations and hypnosis. Like that's all great. But the problem is the subconscious is only the middle layer. So if we were to look at an iceberg, the part of the iceberg that's above the water is the conscious mind. The subconscious would be the part of the iceberg that's just beneath the water surface that you can kind of see, like you can kind of see a little bit of the iceberg beneath the murky water. And so the subconscious is where our limiting beliefs are stored. That's where the things that we can do on autopilot are stored, like your bedtime routine or like, driving to your best friend's house, the things that you can kind of mindlessly do. So the problem though, is that the subconscious is a little bit easier to access. So when we start to hit at that with like reprogramming limiting beliefs and affirmations, we can sometimes start to see a little bit of change, but then also hit some friction. And most people don't understand why. So like, let's say someone's had financial trauma and they want to rewire a limiting belief that like money is really hard, right? So if they're just trying to reprogram their subconscious with affirmations or hypnosis, and they're just like, okay, money's easy, money's easy, money's easy. The problem is the shadow, which is the unconscious mind, which is the deepest part of our psyche, creates the subconscious. So when we have all these limiting beliefs sitting in that subconscious middle realm and we try to hit at it from that realm, if there's enough shit in your shadow that disproves the new belief you're trying to embody, the shadow is going to override that. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so this is where people get stuck because they're like, I have a vision board. I'm doing all these affirmations. I'm doing all this shit. And I'm like, creating money altars and nothing's fucking working. And so the reason for that is because if we're hitting at that middle layer, the shadow's like, LOL, JK, here's lifetimes of trauma that disproves this teeny tiny little belief that you're trying to like manhandle yourself into and just like delicately insert in your brain. And that's where people go wrong. And I say that because obviously any entry point into healing and self-awareness and self-development is amazing. And also that's where people get stuck because they get stuck in kind of like the shallow end of the pool a little bit. And I'm not talking shallow from like a condescending standpoint. It's more of like a consciousness depth standpoint. And then they don't really know why it's not working. And then we start to create all these stories around like, oh, well, this healing modality doesn't work. There's something wrong with me. I'm too traumatized. I can't have these things. And it's like, no, that's not the takeaway. It's just that we're not going deep enough. And so going back to our iceberg metaphor, the unconscious mind, the shadow, is the part of the iceberg that is so big and so deep beneath the water surface, we can't see it. It's not easy to access. And so we have to have a specific way to access that part of our psyche. And I say that because oftentimes when people stumble into shadow work, they're doing it from a journaling standpoint, and you're hitting way more on the subconscious aspect of the psyche. Occasionally, when we journal, if we hit a stream of consciousness, or when we're in therapy and we hit a stream of consciousness, we can start to access little bits of the shadow. But again, that's like scratching the surface. And I'm going to use an example. If I asked everyone listening right now, if you've never done any shadow work, and we're going to talk about what is encompassed in the shadow, but part of that is like past lives and karmic loops and things. So if you've never done any shadow work, and I asked you to journal about your rage and your relationship to your rage and maybe why it's repressed, you could probably hit a stream of consciousness and start to access some stuff. And you'd be like, oh my God, holy shit, I had no idea.
Big. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Scratching the surface on the shadow.
Yeah.
But if I asked you about your most traumatic past life and the karmic loop your soul's been locked in for lifetimes, you can't even begin to journal on that because it's just too deep. And that brings me to the how we do shadow work. My method of doing shadow work, this is the method I recommend for people who really want to go deep, is doing shadow work via a deep meditation. Reason being, when our brain switches into theta brainwaves, that takes us into a deep meditative state. That's what allows us to access the shadow. Because I have all kinds of people come to me and they're like, I can't meditate. I've never meditated. What if I don't see anything in this shadow session? What if I don't, quote unquote, get anything out of this experience? And I'm like, but it's science. If I can get you into a relaxed enough state, your brain will be in theta that will allow us to access the shadow. It's science. And so when people create all these stories about like, I can't do these things, I'm like, listen, you're special, but science still, you cannot override science. You know what I mean? And so like, it helps. It helps people understand that, like, and kind of take the pressure off a little bit. And so when we struggle to meditate, oftentimes it's because we're unguided. If we just like sit here and try to calm our mind, like where all this stuff comes to the surface, whereas when you're doing a guided shadow meditation, if you have a guide taking you into your shadow, that energetic space that's held for you just allows your brain to be like, okay, cool. I don't have to worry about all these distractions because someone's holding this space. I just have to focus on me. And so I say that because oftentimes when people come to me and they're like, I can't meditate, I've tried for years, yada, yada, they can get in so easily when there is a guide or when there's that space held, or even with like a recorded shadow meditation, because there's some kind of structure. And part of this is the way our brain is. Like, we have neural pathways, and when we create a new habit, we're actually creating new grooves in the brain. So if you've never meditated, there's no neural pathways for it. So to expect your brain to easily do something that you've never done, again, science, you know what I mean? So like, we can't like override the structure of the brain, but then we create stories about ourselves that we're not good at something, or we can't do something, or we can never have that experience. And like, that's not the case at all. And so I'm sharing all of this with you and your listeners today to help everyone understand like why this is hard and why this may be something that people struggle to get into. But what I can say is, like, I've worked with people within every aspect of their path. I've worked with people who've like literally never ever meditated a day in their life. I've worked with people who've had like PTSD and like highly traumatized situations. I've also worked with like extremely advanced spiritual practitioners that want to take people to take things to the next level. Like, no matter where you are in your journey, you can do this. It's just about understanding the how and understanding where to meet yourself, because we can't get to like super advanced shadow stuff without ever starting, you know?
Got to do the baby steps.
Yeah.
Well, two things you said so far that are really resonating with me is how shadow work, the term, has been diluted so much. And so I think part of my frustration in researching it and I really wanted to do a podcast on this for a while now, but in researching everything, it sounds more like a journal, like you're plugging in, oh, today was an okay day, or, you know, like a basic diary or whatever you want to call that. And when I think of shadow work, that's not what I think of. I think of like, we're getting into it. Like we're going down there and we're going to do the real world work. Not that journals aren't great and that type of, you know, daily notes isn't going to be helpful. But when I think of shadow work, I'm thinking of what you're talking about, not the more diluted prompts, I think, that are more accessible out on the, you know, on the web and stuff.
Yeah.
And then also,
and that's the thing too, is like because I had explored so many different healing modalities. Like I said, I had been in therapy and like it helped to a degree, but when we start to wake up to like our like the depths of like our conscious mind, we kind of hit that glass floor on like everything that we can really look at from just a conscious, like wakeful state type of lens. We start to feel like we're going in circles. So like I started to get frustrated because I was like, okay, I'm talking about the same thing, but I don't understand like why I can't integrate this, or like why I can't create that change, or like why I can't go deeper and really understand the pattern. And then I started to kind of look into like affirmations and like, you know, manifestation. This is part of why people get frustrated with manifestation. It's like when you think you want something and your shadow thinks it's unsafe and you don't even realize you think it's unsafe, like you can't manifest a thing. So it's like there's a glass ceiling and a glass floor kind of keeping everyone in this really narrow state of being. And then when I've explored like hypnosis and affirmations and all this other stuff, and like nothing was working until I found shadow work, and even shadow work prompts and stuff like was not taking me deep enough until I went into my shadow. And so on that note, there's 4 aspects of the shadow that we can explore, and that is past lives.
Yeah.
And so our past lives are housed in our shadows, even though we incarnate in new bodies, our soul, we carry the same chakra network. Our soul holds the blueprint of every experience that we've had. And
Mm-hmm.
so this is also how we can have trauma like still show up in the body, because if your chakras are holding on to like those shadow imprints and those memories, you can incarnate in a fresh body but still have chronic ailments and pain and illnesses that have carried back from past lives, because you have density stored there, or entities, and like, we can get into that if you want,
Well,
all
that,
kinds of
yeah.
stuff like that. So we have past lives, we have ancestral stuff. So like your
Yes.
ancestry and the lineages that you've been born in, you carry that trauma, and our bodies also carry up to 16 generations of trauma and experiences in
16.
the tissues. Yeah. So there's a lot of shit there, And then on top of that, we have like womb healing and also just like general chakra healing. So like I shared, our chakras hold these memories. And so when I have people go into their shadow and step into their chakras, the way they see and feel those energy centers says a lot about the state of the chakra. So if I were to take you into like your womb or your third eye, if it looks like a dilapidated, creepy castle that's falling apart, that's going to share with you that
Right.
chakra's not functioning optimally, and there's things in there that need to be healed and things like that.
Right. Right.
And then we also have inner child and anything that's really happened in this life. So we can do inner child healing in the shadow, inner teen healing. And this is really powerful too, because like sometimes when we explore traumas from our current life, we think we have conscious awareness around it because we were there in this life. We were
Remember it.
consciously
Yeah.
aware of the things that we experienced, but what we don't understand is what the rest of our psyche took away from that, and
Mhm.
how that's still being framed in our shadow. And so what's interesting is when I do current life healing in the shadow with clients, sometimes they expect to unearth like really fucked up shit, like really traumatic repressed
Yeah.
memories. And like, don't get me wrong, sometimes we do, but it's never an accident. No one
Yeah.
ever is like re-traumatized. Like your brain, your spirit guides, your soul, your body are not going to let you unearth something that you really don't have the coping skills and the capacity to handle and integrate. But what's interesting is oftentimes some of the things that we unearth in the shadow don't seem that traumatic, but they were traumatic to like 4-year-old you who didn't have the tools to process that, or the space held, or your brain was not developed enough. And that's how these things get kicked in the shadow. But then they start to create these imprints and these feedback loops around how our body kind of like drives those patterns moving forward. And then to kind of weave that into the rest of the shadow, oftentimes the traumas that we experience in our current life are part of a larger karmic loop, which is part of like original wounding and ancient past lives. And so what happens is when we have these events
Right.
that get kicked off in past lives that are either so ancient, so traumatic, or just so emotionally jarring, it can throw us into this loop that kind of like ripples through all of our lives,
Right.
sometimes because it feels really familiar to our soul. So our soul continues to seek things with that like frequency and that experience, because what's predictable feels safe to our soul and to our brain. But
Regardless of how bad or dangerous or whatever it is. Yeah.
yeah.
Absolutely.
And other times what happens is our soul's like, okay, shit, I want to heal that. So let's set up a similar scenario to trigger those wounds so that we can heal it. So, but when we incarnate here, we don't know that. And so we get here and all these traumas happen, and they like the way they feel to us is just so intense because of how many lifetimes that has happened to us before, which is why all of our triggers are different, which is why all of our trauma responses are different. This is also why sometimes when we have current life experiences, especially if it's really traumatic, only doing current life healing really isn't fully
Mhm.
rounding that out and healing us, because the root of the problem is like in an ancient life. And so what I tend to find is when people come to me, oftentimes like they have done some semblance of trauma healing, and if they haven't, that's totally okay.
Yeah.
But what's happened is they're like, okay, these things happened to me in this life and I feel like pretty healed, but also like there's pieces missing.
Yeah.
And
Like
that's
they know
because
deep in their heart there's something still not connecting.
yeah.
Yeah.
Or they're
Okay.
like, I haven't been able to get to the bottom of it. And it's almost
Yeah.
like if you were to rip out a weed from your garden, like a really twisted, overgrown thing,
Yeah.
and you just like kind of snipped it at the stem, it's
Yeah.
gonna grow back. Like
Right.
that's kind of what doing only this life healing can do for us. Whereas when we go back to like the original wound, we go back through the karmic loop and understand how our soul is engaged with that pattern or that wound or that experience throughout lifetimes, like that's ripping the root out and healing that completely. Because the goal of shadow work, I want to make one thing perfectly clear, is to not just like go back to past lives and witness all this fucked up shit that we endured and be like, okay, cool, I've had a terrible experience on earth. Like, that's not the point. Like,
Check.
because it's going to start to distort your lens. because and this is what tends to happen when we go back into the shadow. We see trauma, or we see pain, or we see times where we've given away our power, we've seen fear, we've seen loss. And so we can that can distort our lens and be like, oh my God, shit, all I've experienced is trauma and pain. Time on earth fucking blows. Oh my God, I've had a horrible string of incarnations. Like, no, we've also had incredible things that have happened, and vanilla things that are like, have no charge. They're not good. They're not bad. They're just like, whatever. But oftentimes when we're going into the shadow, we're not either setting an intention to explore those things, or there's no real value to see like a mediocre life because there's nothing to heal. There's nothing to do. So I say that because we don't want to let shadow work like distort our lens. And there's amazing things in the shadow aside from trauma. There's aspects of your spiritual gifts. There's aspects of your soul and your power, and the parts of you that you've been told are too much, the parts of you that triggered society, like your magical witchy parts and all that stuff, like that's locked away. And so I say that too, because a lot of times people have an aversion to doing shadow work. So they're like, I don't want to see fucked up shit. Like, so again, we're not just ripping it to the surface, we're healing it, we're reframing how it's stored, and we're integrating that in a healthy way. And also we're unlocking your magic and your power and your wisdom. So you're not just like sitting in pain. Like there's golden parts of your shadow too. Because oftentimes the things that we've been led to believe are unlovable or too much are actually your most powerful magical parts. And society's like, can't control you if you have that integrated. So we're going to make you repress that shit. So like I say that because I want people to understand that the shadow is so magical. It's not just scary, and it's not just pain.
Have you seen people that are struggling with something that has later through the shadow work been identified as a repeated, event or trauma that they have life after life after life, and then seen them work through it so it is a healed portion that is not carried forward?
Oh yeah. It's really, oh my God, it's amazing. So I have seen people heal some incredible things. And this is part of why, like, if someone's going to engage with shadow work, in whatever capacity they do it, I really recommend embarking upon it as if it's a journey, like actually committing to the journey. Because what happens is our society has a very instant gratification lens on things. And that's part of the programming, like we live in a microwave society. We want to press a button, pop a pill, and have everything be good. Like shadow work is so profound, but it's not a one and done. Like, it's really not the kind of thing where like, we're going to go into the shadow once or twice and then be like, and I manifested my dream life. Like,
oh my gosh.
No. Right. And I say that because the people that I've experienced, the clients that have had the most powerful shifts, have committed to themselves and their growth in whatever capacity. Some of them have worked with me for 1 year, 2 year, 3 years. Like some of them have really committed, and other ones have done really deep work and then continued on their own, or done work and then stepped away, integrated it, come back. And it's not like you have to do shadow work with me. That's not at all where I'm going with this. What I'm saying is looking at it as, this is my journey into myself. Because what I tend to find is we all want to unearth some juicy shit in our shadow. We all want to get to the depths of our blockages and liberate ourselves. And that doesn't happen inside of like 2 sessions, because it would traumatize the absolute living shit out of you, because it would be too much. Like, you know what I mean? And so the clients that I've seen have these insane, profound healing experiences where maybe they've had like a really intense trauma in this life. Maybe it was a sexual trauma or something like really, really jarring, really traumatizing. We are able to heal that and reframe that experience and help them understand like, because a lot of this too is like our soul has chosen experiences. And so we're not blaming ourselves for a trauma, but understanding the higher purpose of us having incarnated in a life with these experiences, because it pulls us out of that victim mindset. What did we want to learn? What did we want to experience? But then we start to go back through these lives, we see, okay, that's happened in a lot of lives. Why? What was that original event? What's kicked that off? What kind of loops kind of like rippled out from that? And so when we start to go back and heal those, like that is a very deep, consistent process. And so I have seen people, because I've had people in abusive relationships, I've had people with intense, like violent traumas and things like that, like actually able to close down those loops and have a regulated nervous system. But it all just depends on our capacity. So like, if you're not taking care of yourself outside of shadow work, like, because there's so many people that are like, I want to unearth this stuff, but it's like, if you're not sleeping, if you're not taking care of yourself, if your nervous system's dysregulated, like your brain's not going to let you see see more trauma and just like add fuel to the fire. And so what I tend to find is when people are doing long-term shadow work, it's helping them get regulated. It's helping them see those patterns. And so especially with like karmic connections, like the people that we have that charge with, and there's so much chemistry, but there's also so much volatility and pain and trauma. Like we don't understand why we can't step away. There's so much entanglement. And so I've seen people, I've led people through these patterns, understanding like the things that keep them bound to their pain and their trauma and their fear, the things that pull them off the path of their purpose and their spiritual gifts, like really liberate themselves. And so oftentimes the things that really trigger us, like there's something on the other side of the fire. Like we have to walk through that. And I think we live in a society where there was no mental health awareness. And now we've swung really hard in the opposite direction of like, I can never be triggered. Like, no, your triggers are showing you things like it's uncomfortable. It's dysregulating to your nervous system. And if you have the tools to regulate yourself, we can look at these triggers, because sometimes what's on the other side of that trigger is something that we want. And like, so when people like with witchcraft and stuff, like the word witch triggers the ever living shit out of you, you're probably a fucking witch and you're scared, you know, and your shadow's like, no, we can't do that again.
Don't talk about it. Well, I have a question to something you just said too, that, you know, knowing that if somebody is on this line of shadow work, not the journaling or more lighter area of it, but like we're going in, clearly your own personal physical health and emotional health outside of the journaling is going to be important to balance it all out. But how would you suggest one would not compartmentalize, but life goes on, right? We can't, you know, like I run a business. I've got my own company. Like I've got to go to work. I've got employees to take care of and things like that. I can't just be sad all the time because I dove down deep into the shadows. Is there a way to work with somebody or guide, you know, have yourself say, this is it. We're closing the book. Everything's okay. And not switch gears to go be the business owner or, you know, I'm not sure if I'm phrasing it right, but it's hard to think of, like, you know, most people know there's probably a lot of work to do if you're going to go down deep into that third level of the iceberg, right?
Yeah.
How do you turn it off and on so you can do the work that definitely needs to be done, but also still live your life?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I think that's, again, another fear and another roadblock to people doing this work.
Yeah.
And so what I can say, there's a couple different aspects of that to discuss. And part of it is we're not going to just like rip fucked up stuff to the surface and then be like, all right, cool, gonna go to work now.
Yeah.
Like the way, and I know it's probably really hard to explain this to people who've never experienced it. So I'm going to do my best. Like when we, for example, if I were to take you back to a past life and you witness something that was really jarring and really traumatic, there are times where the guides are like, I'm going to just summarize this for you and you're not going to see or feel anything because it's too traumatic. Like your guides know what you have the capacity to handle. And we can't override that because our ego is like, I'm fine. You know what I mean? Like your guides are like, no, this is unnecessary.
I know. Yeah.
There are other times where they're like, for me, they've always been like, you can fucking handle it. So like, I've witnessed all kinds of things, like, you know, like
it's happening.
I've seen it. I've felt it. I've relived it, but it was necessary in those moments for that to happen. But the session doesn't end there. So like, as the practitioner, I'm never going to let someone be in the throes of like extreme grief or fear and then be like, all right, time's up.
Bye.
You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
So to give you an idea of what happens when we do that, we are going into the shadows. So let's say we go into a past life. Let's say we explore a witch wound. So let's say we see a life where something terrible happened because you're using your gifts, you were aligned with your magic and your purpose, and it was violent and scary. And oftentimes the witch wound is layered with a bunch of other stuff, because like oftentimes not only have we been murdered in terrible ways, but like we've been betrayed by our sisters or our families or our lovers, and we've lost businesses. And, you know, so it's money wounding, and it's feminine wounding, and it's witch wounding, and it's betrayal, and it's loss, and it's all this shit packed into one thing.
Yes.
So there's such a charge there. So when we're experiencing that, again, it's never re-traumatizing, because we do have the choice to witness from third person instead of first. There are times where people tend to see things from their first person, like and there's value to that. There are times where people witness it from third person, kind of like you're watching a movie. And there are times where you don't see anything and the guides are like, this happened. That's all you need to know, you know, and you're not, it really just depends. And it's not like you're not strong enough or resilient enough if they don't show you things. There's just times where the guides are like, you don't need to read
right now.
This, and that's fine, you know, or not yet or whatever. But then when we understand the event, there are very specific questions that I will feed the guides to answer you, or feed you to ask the guides, because we don't just want to look at an event and be like, wow, what the fuck? Like we want to understand. And so part of that's like, why did this happen? What did my soul take away versus what did I want to learn? Because oftentimes, like our soul, like anyone who lived through the witch trials, like their soul incarnated to be there for that experience from a collective standpoint to like, in order to shift and ascend as like as a collective, we need to go to our collective depths and understand the ways that we destroy each other and our collective unconscious. And so we've incarnated to participate in those experiences. And then we have malevolent entities and vampiric spirits and things that kind of like exacerbate those karmic loops. And we can unpack that if you want. But what happens is like our soul incarnated for a very specific collective reason, but also individual reason. Like perhaps we wanted to understand what it felt like to be the black sheep and be the rebel in a society that didn't understand in times where the veil was very heavy. There's probably very specific things. But then unfortunately, when the trauma hits, when we're in our human body, we have the constraints of our human psyche. Sometimes our soul underestimates like how much that's going to rock us. And we come out of that life and we forget the higher purpose. And we're like, oh, can't use my magic anymore. I have to hide, like, because that the trauma imprint is so deep. And we have contracted experiences, like our soul contracts, the things we agree to experience, sometimes are exacerbated by our free will. So sometimes we get here and like we don't act according to plan, or soul tribe members don't act the way our soul had it intended. And so then that kind of like twists the knife a little bit more, so we can come out of these experiences with a completely different takeaway. And so the questions I have people ask is to really help them understand, like, what did your soul desire to learn? Because when you can understand the why, like most people don't realize that's actually what they're seeking. Like it's really difficult to go through immense trauma, but if you understand that there was a divine purpose behind it, it's a little bit easier to sit with. And so we want to understand what our soul took away, how it's still affecting us now, because there are so many ways that lives in us, even if it's really, really subtle. There's anything else that we need to know, but then we facilitate energetic healing. This can look like extracting trauma and density, cutting cords with people in that life. You may need to speak with your past life self. There are even times where the guides will let you hit rewind and make a different choice if the lesson was around sovereignty and free will. Because oftentimes when we're out of our power, we don't feel in control. We don't feel like we had other options. And time's not linear. Like time is a human construct. So when we're in the astral, when we're in spirit, like time doesn't exist. So when we hit rewind and undo it, we're actually reframing how that's stored in our shadow. And so when we understand, like, fuck, I had the power of choice, everything could have gone down differently. We're not being delusional, pretending like the witch trials didn't happen, but what we're doing is saying I have power. I have choice. I have free will. And even if I can't control anything going on around me, I can always control how I choose to show up. And if I choose to give my power away.
Now, are you talking, it sounds like you're talking about that third layer of the iceberg. Like you're way down there going backwards. You're not talking about something that you made choices of in this lifetime. You're going.
No, we are going deep. We are going. Oftentimes, this is like some karmic loop shit where we get stuck in the pattern of like, let's say it's a power wound. Let's say we've given our power away over and over and over and over and over. We go back to the very first time where our soul learned that we had to do that. And we realized like, wow, in that moment, I felt so powerless. I felt so helpless, but I had so much power. All I had to do was say no. All I had to do was choose what I wanted. And don't get me wrong, there's layers to this. Sometimes there's a malevolent parasitic entity attachment or vampiric spirit or curse or something that's kind of pushing against us, kind of pushing us into a decision to betray ourselves, because these malevolent beings feed off of that. So like there's a lot of layers to this. So it's not always just as simple as like saying no when I said yes. Like it's not always that simple. But what I can say is understanding that like we have far more power at any given time. And society has programmed us to believe that we don't. We've had far more free will and far more options that are immediately visible in front of us, even when it feels like we have none. And when we go back to these moments and we even just like lay out, the guides will say, okay, well, here are some other options you could have chosen. Not because we don't want to beat ourselves up. That's not what it's about, but it's understanding that when we can slow ourselves down in those moments and say, okay, like what do I need for me, or what else is an option that's not immediately in front of me, it actually starts to shift how your brain operates in this life.
That's literally what I was thinking as you were saying that, like, it's teaching you that if it does happen to pop up again, if it does happen to repeat, you have the choice to make a different, to go down a different road.
Yes. And so that brings me back to your question. When we're wrapping up a session, no matter how deep or no matter how intense, like sometimes people are unearthing grief and rage, and like we're doing things to facilitate that process. By the time this session ends, like you actually feel really good and really light. Like I've never had a client walk away from a session and not feel good, no matter how intense it was. And even in my own shadow work, the things that I'm unearthing now, like sometimes it can be so, because when you really build that resilience and that self-trust and that safety in your body and your soul and your nervous system, the things that you're able to witness and handle are wild and insane sometimes, but we never end on that note. And so when you're extracting this density and you're releasing those emotions, sometimes people are crying, sometimes people are like, there's so much stuff going on. But then as the guides are extracting that and we're doing all this healing, and sometimes I will do something magical at the end if it was a very heavy session, like we're not going to be like, all right, goodbye Salem, you know what I mean? Like we might go down to the underworld, we might go to a different magical realm, they might meet a new guide, they might speak to, whatever. And so like we're wrapping it up on a really positive, good note. And oftentimes they're getting either some action steps or they're getting some kind of like activation. Like sometimes after going through the fire like that in a past life, the guides are going to activate your gifts now, because they're like, okay, you healed your witch wound a little bit, now we can kind of like open up your third eye a little more. Like so there's always like this positive aspect to it. So I've never, first and foremost, had a client come out of it traumatized. I've never had a client come out of it and not be able to function, because you're right, life does go on and we can't be diving into our shadow in a way that's like destructive to our current life, and we can't be escaping our current life by doing all this work either. And that brings me to your question and the second point that I'm bringing up. Integration is the missing piece with people doing this work, because what I tend to see happen, obviously there's a huge barrier to starting because people don't know how, or they get stuck with like that subconscious middle layer. Right. Or when people do break through and they dive into the shadow, the other pitfall that people experience is they're doing all this deep energetic healing and they get really good at going into meditation and going into their shadow. But that's only part of the work. People think shadow work and the experience of going into your shadow is the hard part. It's not. The hard part is when you come out of the session and you figure out how to move through your life in a way that integrates that work. And what I mean by that is, let's say we uncover that there's a pattern of self-betrayal. And this is really common in our society. We're all programmed to do this, right? So let's say we uncover that we're betraying ourselves in our relationships to seek love and seek safety. We're betraying ourselves at work to not get fired or to get a promotion, like whatever's happening, right? We want to understand where that pattern comes from. So we're going to go into our shadow. We're going to go back to some past lives. We're going to see the lives that reinforce that pattern. If someone is able to, meaning their guides are like, you're ready for this, you can handle it, we might go back to an original wound that kicked off that pattern for the very first time. And so we understand now like how the wound started, how it's kind of rippled out, how it's affecting you now, right? So let's say we do a bunch of energetic healing. We extract those imprints, we extract that density, we cut cords with that trauma, maybe we hit rewind and make a different choice so that we're putting you back in the seat of your power and that original life. You come out of that session, you feel really good. Okay, but the work starts, because now we have to continue to break that pattern down when we move through our life. And so what happens is
that's your conscious state.
People don't. Yeah, exactly. But this is where people will either they don't know the appropriate action steps to take, or they're like, fuck, I don't want to do that. I don't want to say no. So what happens is we move through our life, and this is where people get frustrated because our internal and external realities are linked. And so when we do a lot of really deep shadow work and we start to shift our internal reality vastly, if we're not integrating, there's essentially no bridge between internal and external. And so our internal reality starts to feel really different, but our external looks the same and feels the same. And people start to get really frustrated. Then that's where they start to get stuck on their journey, or they start to self-sabotage, or they start to say that this isn't working because they're not manifesting. There's no shifts. They're not realizing what bridges the gap is that integration, which is like sometimes very simple, but very profound action steps. And so this is part of the reason why I work with the guides that I work with. I work with underworld beings and divine dark beings, especially the Goetic Infernals and other underworld deities, is they will step in and they trigger certain experiences in your life that bring you an opportunity to see the pattern and then choose differently. So what'll happen, especially
so hard.
I know, and it's actually so fucking scary in the beginning. It's like, as someone who was like a chronic people pleaser and self-betrayer, like literally it was so scary when I would come out of my shadow and be like, oh no, now this is like the hard part, because now I'm gonna have to like actually break down this pattern by not betraying myself, which means not people pleasing, which means letting people be mad. And so this is where we really have to lean on those tools, because our nervous system seeks safety in either not angering people and betraying people. We seek safety and validation and the love that we receive from that. And so what starts to happen, especially if you're working with those guides, is you're understanding these things, because what tends to happen is, this is a fear of people doing shadow work. They don't understand that like the energetic work is going to trigger external events. So like if you just did a whole session on people pleasing and self-betrayal, buckle up, be prepared that pattern is going to be triggered in your life in the next, days, coming weeks, whatever. And so you're going to come out, and then your coworker might be like, hey, I need you to pick up this shift for me. And you're going to your nervous system is going to be like, say yes. And your shadow is going to be like, what did we just talk about? And so what I recommend in those moments is the integration happens in you being aware of what you're moving through. So if you just move through people pleasing and self-betrayal, understand that is a pattern you're actively going to have to break down. We can remove all of these imprints in your auric field that we want, but we still have to translate this into action, because that is how you step into your power.
And that's also how you rewire, right? Things are getting rewired every time you choose the right course or
exactly. Like I was just going to say, like when we stepping into your power has become such a buzzword, and we just want to feel empowered. Yeah. But that comes from like walking through the fire. Yep. And so when we're building neural pathways, like you just mentioned, like every time we say no and choose ourselves, we want to say yes, we build a neural pathway for it. Every time we set a boundary, when our nervous system wants to self-betray like a mofo because we want to be loved by that person and not make them mad, we build a new neural pathway and we reinforce that, and those grooves get deeper and it gets easier to the point where then that becomes unconscious. It becomes a new way you move through the world. You're going to be like, no, I can't. Instead of like over-explaining and over-apologizing, or instead of saying, yeah, sure, and then like resenting the fuck out of the person, like we step into our power by doing that hard work every single day. And I know this doesn't sound sexy or magical. No. It gets easier. Those first couple times are the scariest, because when we are, it feels like a pivotal moment when you come out of that shadow session, whether it's the next day or the same day or 2 weeks from now, and someone's asking you something or an opportunity presents itself that is every fiber of your being is screaming to go back to the old way, to people please, to twist and contort into someone that they want you to be, to
again,
say
it's familiar,
yes.
Right? It's familiar. Yes. Right or wrong, it's still familiar.
And our brain views safety solely what is familiar and predictable, which is why people don't leave abusive relationships, which is why we don't quit the soul-sucking job, which is why we don't move across the country. This is why we don't do those things, because our brain's like, shit, our current reality sucks and it's traumatizing us, but we can predict it. So therefore, this is safe. We cannot change anything. We need to understand this, because then when we feel that fear, we can actually reframe our relationship with it. So now when I feel fear, I'm like, this is good. I'm at my edge. The fear is good. This means that I'm on the brink of an up level. I'm on the brink of a shift. If I can feel the fear and do it anyway, this is good. Whereas we're programmed to be like, oh my God, I'm afraid. This is bad. I'm in danger. I'm going to get eaten by a bear, because that's what our brain is doing to us. Like, it's those old ancient survival mechanisms are kicking in. And so in that moment, what I recommend is, even if we can't muster out the words no, at least take a pause and say, hey, I'm feeling really overwhelmed. I can't answer you right now. I need a little bit of space. And if you need an immediate answer, then it's going to have to be no. And so what we can do is buy ourselves some time. So in that moment, if you're like borderline panic attack, like I can't say no to this person, just be like, hey, this is actually not a good time. I'll shoot you a text about this later. And so we don't want to necessarily do that forever, but when we buy ourselves time, you can regulate your nervous system so that you're not forcing yourself, because we have to do things within our window of tolerance. If you feel like you're being electrocuted in that moment, nervous system wise, you probably don't have the capacity to say absolutely not. Right. And that's okay. So when we can slow ourselves down, because oftentimes these initial gut reactions are coming from that wounded place, and we can say, hey, I actually can't give you a response on that right now. Or, hey, now's not a good time. Let's talk about this later. Or, hey, I'll shoot you a text because like, I'm not really sure right now.
But how empowering is that? Just that is empowering. It's buying you time to slow down and think about it and come up with the right answer that's appropriate for you and your growth.
Exactly. And so I'm saying all of this because this is notoriously the place where people get stuck, because they'll start to do all this stuff and they start to unearth all their magic, but they're like, I don't understand. I'm not accessing it now. The magic is in the work that we avoid. The magic is in the scary shit. The magic is in sometimes the mundane, saying no, speaking up for yourself, setting a boundary, and letting people react how they're going to react. And that's also really scary. And so this is a third facet to kind of what you're talking about. When we start to really do deep shadow work, and we do start to integrate that in how we show up, it will shift your external reality. And sometimes that does bring tower moments. And so I have, and like, I will never speak on or walk someone through a fire that I have not already gone through. So like the everything I talk about are lived experiences personally, and also client experiences. So like the tower moments that I have personally hit have been insane. And so what I can say with that is the universe will never take anything away that's for you. the things that have fallen away after deep shadow work were things that were misaligned, were karmic, were things that were causing me pain, were things that were keeping me stuck. And sometimes that's really painful. And so these things will never fall away when we don't have the capacity to move through the grief or the loss or the transitions or whatever. And I say that because that's another fear. People are like, shit, what am I going to have to see and sit with and lose? Who am I going to have to become? Like, people literally will tell me, like, I don't want to heal my witch wound because I don't want to have to be a witch. And I'm like,
really?
Yeah, because they're like, there's shadows like that, certain that they're a witch, and also that scared of having to embody it, you know? And so we're never shown something that we don't have the capacity to create change around yet. And sometimes the guides will drop breadcrumbs, like the tower moments that I ended up hitting, meaning, like, for anyone listening who doesn't know what that means, it's like in tarot, the tower cards, like, shit's gonna fucking crumble whether you like it or not. Like, yeah, it's we've had little opportunities to kind of make those changes, and sometimes we're like, oh, don't want to, and like the guides will drop little breadcrumbs and nudges, and then the tower hits, because it's like, okay, if you don't want to walk away, like, we have to pull this away because this is not serving you, this is pulling you from your soul path. And part of when we're in our shadow, when we're working closely with our guides, whoever those beings may be, it's also facilitating that reciprocity and that trust and that love and that safety, so that when we do hit these tower moments and things fall away, we can trust that it's all happening for our highest good. Because that is also part of the magic, right? Magic is faith, it's trust, it's surrender. It's not death gripping things and thinking we know everything. Like, the magic is in those voids and in those windows. And I say that because people are always afraid of what shadow work is going to trigger. When they understand how it works, they're like, shit, how is this going to shift my life?
Right.
And sometimes it wildly shifts it, because sometimes the life that we've built was built from your shadow and built from wounding. And sometimes things have to fall away and people have to fall away. But other times you have a beautiful opportunity to reshift and recontract. And so sometimes people are afraid that they're like going to have to get divorced or like whatever, but other times their relationship shifts and it deepens in a beautiful way because both people are growing and evolving, and that's not a karmic connection. Other times veils do drop on karmic connections and it's like, well, fuck, you know. But regardless, when we're doing deep shadow work and we're building deep self-trust and safety within self and within our soul path and within our guides, we are able to move through those moments with, it's not going to always feel good, but we are able to trust ourselves, to not betray ourselves. We're able to trust our guides, that we're not being punished. Cause like we also start to then unravel some of that programming around religion, et cetera. Like when bad things happen, like Sky Daddy's not punishing us. Like if we believe everything's happening for our highest good, we're able to then at least move through those difficult periods with a little bit more either ease, faith, trust, flow, safety, because we understand that there's something for us on the other side. And it's not just like all pain and trauma for no reason.
So how would one know, and I like the iceberg analogy, because I'm going to go right back to that. Like, how would you know if you're ready to start this stuff? Would you already be getting kind of like where I'm at? Like, this is just what we need to do to get to that next level? Or what are some little signs that would say, hey, you're ready? And don't think we're going down to that third level of the iceberg. We're going to start off at the beginning with stuff you can handle and work our way through it. Like, how are there signs that people usually get, or how would you know, like, this is it, it's time?
Oh, for sure. So I would say like the degree of the sign really varies. And sometimes that depends on how long someone's been avoiding something. So I have clients who will like, you know, the guides will drop like a podcast like this. They'll like listen to this. And like, sometimes it will feel like a very visceral reaction. Like when shadow work started to find me, I feel my soul like vibrate in my body. I was like, oh my God, wow, that was really intense, like, but not in a bad way, like in a magical way. I was like, oh my, I need to dive into this. And that kept happening. Like books would come into my life. Someone would say the word, I'd be listening to a podcast and all of a sudden they'd have someone on talking about shadow work. And I was like, okay, like these repeated signs continue to find you, or you'll have like a visceral reaction when you're hearing someone talk about it. And usually it's the stronger it is, the more important it is for you to take immediate action, because the guides are like, we need you to do this yesterday. Like, you know, like look into it.
And I would say sending like, you signs, what are you doing?
Right. And so usually too, like if anyone's listening to this episode, like it's not a coincidence that you're listening to this, but like the degree of urgency, I would say really varies. Like if your soul's like vibrating in your body, like you probably need to do this like immediately, but shadow work can benefit anybody. because at the end of the day, like, we don't control the journey. And even as a practitioner, like I say this all the time, I don't control the journey. So like, we can set an intention, but your guides are going to, sometimes I've had people's guides hijack the session, be like, nope, we're doing this instead. Like, and so the guides will always know what you can handle. Cause there are people who are like, I don't think I can handle a lot. And the guides give them so much. And they're like, oh my God, I can't believe I was able to see and experience all of that. Like, so even if you're brand new, it's not to say that you're not going to get a lot. Like, I've seen people have one or two brand new with shadow, profound experiences. It really just depends. But no matter where you are in your journey, whether you want to unlock your spiritual gifts, whether you want to understand like any glass ceilings you have around love, money, success. I mean, if you struggled with money and receiving and self-worth, like that's a whole aspect of the shadow we can dive into. Like it can benefit anybody. And so even people who aren't super spiritual, which I'm sure like you have a witchy podcast, I'm sure everyone's spiritual, but like I've worked with people who are like, they knew they needed to dive deeper than what they were doing. And they're like, I don't really know how I feel about like anything that you do, but I know I need to do shadow work. And so I have on occasion worked with people and used, instead of like, you know, because my guides are like Hades and like Lilith and Lucifer and like demons. And so like some people are like, I can't fucking handle that. And I'm like, that's fine. We will use Archangel Michael, or we will use your grandma, or we will use a spirit animal. And they'll go into their shadow in that way. Cause like, again, I'm not transposing my beliefs on anybody. I don't give a fuck if people work with these guides or not, but shadow work can benefit anybody. If someone wants to understand why they can't earn above a certain amount of money, or why they can't ever get out of a pattern in their marriage, like, I mean, it's these things are things that we're blind to. So whether we're going back to ancient karmic loops that originated in like a very ancient life, or whether we're trying to understand why your income can't transcend a certain amount of money, like we can do all of that in the shadow. So shadow work benefits anybody and everybody. It just depends on how like called you feel. When we feel called or curious about something, it is for us. And we make things hard by saying, well, it can't possibly be for me because I want it. And can it be that easy? Like, yes, it can. Let's not make things harder than they have to be. You know what I mean?
Let's do it. Yeah, exactly. And how powerful, like everything you're saying, it seems as hard as it's going to be to possibly move through it. There are tools to move through it. There are people to help you move through it. And that end result, again, you still have to make the choice, right? You still have to choose the right choices, but how powerful and what a next level you could in your practice and your beliefs and everything go to if you could just do the work.
Yeah. And the one thing I will say too, is because like human beings are hardwired. We're hardwired to be hard on ourselves and put pressure on ourselves. Like, I don't want people to think that like you have to come out of a shadow session and then it's like life or death, make the right fucking choice for the next 2 weeks. You know, like it's not like that. You are going to fuck up sometimes, you know, like there were definitely times, especially when I was breaking down people pleasing and self-betrayal, that pattern was so deeply ingrained in me in this life and it served me. You know, I was that classic overachiever academically, all that stuff. We are hardwired and it serves us in so many ways, which is why it's so baked into our society. There are going to be times where you still self-betray. You're just going to be abundantly aware of it. And so when I would, even in tiny ways, I would feel it in my body. I'd be like, oh my God, I am so aware. This feels terrible.
To the bone, you felt it. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I felt it so deeply. And I was like, wow, I was blind to this before. I was numb to this before. Now that I'm awake to this pattern, my body and my soul are showing me like I could feel my soul like contort in my body. And I was like, wow, I can't do this anymore. And oftentimes, because I've seen people do this too, I've seen people unearth patterns or dynamics or toxic connections that they just like can't let go of. And their guides are like, listen, if you don't let this person go, if you don't stop self-sabotaging this way, you are going to hit some terrible shit. And they're like, no, we're not driving that bus. Like it's going to continue to get more painful to force you to learn. It's almost like if you're holding on to a pan that's hot and the heat turns up and up and up and up and up and up, eventually your body's going to force you to let go. It's kind of like that. And so if we don't feel like we have enough sovereignty and power to let go, we're going to keep walking into these patterns and the heat's going to continue to get turned up by the universe to force us to let go. So just know that like we do have a choice and you are going to fuck up a little bit. And if there's something you really don't want to face, you're going to have to face it eventually. So you can choose to face it now on your terms, or the universe will serve it to you on its terms.
And again, you said the guides will kind of help and know what we're able to handle at a certain time, right?
Always.
So the deeper you get into it, they're not going to throw the big stuff at you right away. Like they're going to ease you into it so that you can feel more confident and just keep working through everything.
And what I can say on that too is like when we've done this work in past lives, because sometimes people are like blown away at never having done any shadow work and seeing like wildly profound shit. When our soul's done a lot of really deep spiritual work, it's not, those gifts don't go away. That capacity for that skill doesn't go away. Our soul retains all of our experiences and gifts and wisdom. And we also retain old past life connections with guides, which is how people can come into this life really connected to like ancient deities and things like that.
Yes.
So like the work that you've done in past lives lays a foundation for now. And I say that because there are sometimes people who don't expect the experience to be profound or connections to be so deep. And very quickly, the experience is deep and the connections are deep and they're kind of blown away. It's because your soul's laid the groundwork. You've done this work. Like my first shadow session was fucking insane. That's because I've done this work before in past lives. So it was like the guides were like, oh, you're back again. Let's go. You know, but like the second part of that is arguably the most magical part of shadow work, because when we are, if you or anyone listening is participating in a shadow either program or using a guided meditation or working with a mentor, they're holding that sacred space in the 3D and in the astral, but then we're calling forth your guides in the astral because they're going to be the ones leading you through these things. And so if you're clairvoyant, clairsentient, like you're going to see and feel these beings next to you, and they're going to really hold you energetically every step of the way. And this is also what builds that trust, is because they're going to walk you through some of the most difficult moments that of your soul's incarnation experience. And also you're going to feel so supported and so loved. And that's what builds that trust, but it's what builds that
safety, right? That safety, like that safety, like,
yes,
this is okay. This is your room and you're about to work in.
Yes. And so when we are connecting with the guides so much in shadow, that's what allows us to connect with them outside of it. It almost builds like an energetic bridge. And I say this because everyone wants to be able to talk to their guides all the time, right? Like, and maybe not everybody, but a lot of people, most people come to me, they're like, I just want to hear my guides. I just want to be able to talk to them. I want to be able to feel them. I want to be able to like get messages. And that's the beauty of it, is when we are diving so deep and we're building that connection and you are familiarizing yourself with their energy signature and the way they speak or the signs that they give you and the way their messages come through. When we do that frequently enough, it's like building a muscle. It's almost like if you wanted to run a marathon, you're not going to be able to just like go outside tomorrow and run like 26 miles. Like you might be able to run one and then like you're going to build off that. And so because spirituality is intangible, people think that like it skips, like we could skip over the consistency and just like have the thing. And it doesn't work like that. It's an energetic muscle. So if you're not meditating, connecting with your guides, doing shadow work, there is no bridge that's built. Whereas like every time you go into shadow work to go into a past life or even go into a deep shadow meditation just to connect with your guides, you're laying bricks on that little energetic bridge to the point where then you can hear them and you can feel them. And it makes life a hell of a lot easier, because then in these moments where you feel like you're hitting a fork in the road and you need guidance, and you feel like you need to make a decision, you don't have to be like, all right, well, let me just go into meditation tomorrow and see what the guides have to say. Like you can trust yourself and your intuition, because we don't want to outsource our power to anything, not even our spirit team. We can love them, respect them, build reciprocity. But at the end of the day, like we are sovereign. We're, in the seat of our power. But if we need their guidance, we need to be able to sometimes get that on the spot without being in meditation. We need to be able to trust our intuition and feel our intuition enough in those moments. And I always say, like, if we are not moving through our life connected to ourselves, then when we hit these massive forks in the road, we don't have access to our intuition because you haven't used it. It's like, if you're not using it, all these other in these micro moments and building that trust with self and trust with that internal navigating system, when you're faced with a huge decision, like, do I move? Do I quit my job? Like, we don't know what these things feel like in our body because we haven't cultivated that gift. We haven't strengthened our connection to it. We haven't built that self-trust because we're not using it anywhere else. And so there's many little exercises we can do to connect with our guides, connect with our intuition, connect with our body to really feel these things. But oftentimes we can't feel jack shit if there's tons of trauma in our field. Like if you're dissociated, disconnected, if your shadow's spilling out into your conscious mind, which manifests as like anxiety, depression, panic attacks, like, when we start to get these mental health symptoms, your shadow's so full, it's spilling over like an overflowing trash can into your conscious mind. And so some of this stuff we can walk back. Like I've had severe anxiety my whole life. I don't have anxiety now ever, unless there's like an entity or a vampire. Like I know how these like malevolent things manifest frequency wise in my body, or if I'm feeling something energetically, or if there's something that I'm avoiding. Like these things happen to alert us to something. But when our shadow is so full of trauma, it starts to manifest as like mental health issues. And when we let it go too far, it's really hard to walk back. It's possible, but it's more challenging. You know what I mean? And so I say
is there a point of no return? Like, can it get that far where there's no more work to do because you're just not capable of getting through it?
I would never say that there's no more work to do, because I've worked with people who've even had like personality disorders. And so what tends to happen with that is like if DNA essentially has like unraveled to a degree where a personality disorder has been become very severe, we can't like undo that, but shadow work can absolutely help someone manage that, because like the big pharma and the matrix and all this stuff will have us believe that these things are death sentences.
Right.
You know, like I have this thing, so therefore I'm a victim to it and I am like controlled by it and this is my fate. No, like even if that is a product of your experience or your trauma, because a lot of times these mental health disorders develop from severe trauma, you know, or experiences that have been less than ideal in life, especially in childhood, we can absolutely reframe how we engage with that diagnosis and how we move through the world. So like if you're someone who has like extreme rage cycles, like there could be entities and vampires like absolutely exacerbating that. So we can take care of that. We can also help you release some of that repressed rage. So when you do hit these moments, we can reframe how you're able to handle that and how you're able to communicate those things. And so I've never met somebody who was just like, you know, had something that was like, quote unquote, so far gone, because I think that that's really disempowering for people to be like, I am broken and have to ride out the rest of this incarnation like shit and hope that I can handle this in the next one. Because that's essentially what we're saying, right?
Yeah, it's a sentence.
Right, exactly. And so I firmly believe that it really just depends on how bad someone wants to meet themselves. You know, because again, I've worked with people with all different, you know, PTSD and things like that. Like, if you're willing to walk through the fire, I'm willing to walk with you and we'll see what happens, because there's never any harm in going into the shadow, because we're unearthing the trauma and stuff that's either exacerbating or perpetuating things that are causing you pain.
It makes me think of another question, if we still have time.
Yeah, go for it.
The people that have had trauma and have gone through their doctors or their psychiatrists, psychologists, and they are on something to help manage the depression or the anxiety, an actual medication. Can that medication still be taken while you start to work on shadow work, or do those two things conflict?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I have two things to say on that. The first is one of the biggest factors of whether someone is ready for shadow work from a safety standpoint is how much trauma you're currently experiencing. And this is a double-edged sword, because oftentimes when we're in a traumatic experience, whether you're in an abusive relationship or whatever trauma is surfacing for you, like you need more conscious awareness and healing and regulation to get you out. But if you are too traumatized, you're not going to be able to go into the shadow because you're so dysregulated. Like if you can't meet more trauma than you're already experiencing. And so when someone's in absolute crisis, that's not the time to do shadow work, unfortunately. Like if you are,
that's a perfect thing to say. Thank you. Yeah.
I'm saying that because one of my friends used to do a lot of work around healing sexual trauma. And so, I mean, domestic abuse survivors absolutely need that work. But if you are fleeing a violent situation and are homeless, that's not the time to do shadow work, because you are already in so much trauma and you may not even feel dysregulated if you were dissociated, because your brain is protecting you from feeling the extent of your life. Like people need to have a decent amount of physical and emotional safety, because we can't start to unearth a karmic loop around domestic violence. If you're actively experiencing it, it's going to be too much for your system. So there has to be a decent amount of safety, which can be really frustrating for people who are like, I can't climb out of this. And everyone's different. Like I've worked with people who were in a decent amount of trauma, but also had a decent amount of safety, where they experienced immense trauma around grief or loss of a family member and things like that, but they were at a stable enough place, like financially and physically, where they were able to start to unpack that. Everyone's different. There really is no black or white, but I say that because sometimes the people who need it or want it the most are still actively in extreme trauma. We can't add more fuel to the fire at that point. And I say that so that people are fully aware. For your medication question, I do not recommend anyone stopping medication to do shadow work, because if you are on mood stabilizers and things, like, to please fucking continue to take that shit. Like, you know, I am not a doctor, so we are not going to throw you into some kind of episode because you decided to just like stop all your meds. Also, these things require usually tapers and stuff, and that is something only a doctor should help you with. A. B. What I found is people who are on medication, especially SSRIs, it numbs you, right? Because it's shrinking the peaks and valleys emotionally. And so it can make shadow a little bit more challenging, which just means that you have to give yourself grace. Typically, we have to go slower, especially if you're someone with like PTSD and stuff.
Right.
You have to go slower, which means that I really recommend either working with a mentor or understanding that this journey is going to go at whatever fucking pace you need it to go for your brain.
Sure.
So I've had people dive into shadow and get very little the first couple times until their brain starts to be like, okay, we're not going to be traumatized. This
Right.
is okay. You know, like, and then we start to do a little bit more, like we have to go at the pace that your brain and your soul needs, not at the pace that you feel like you want to go at, you know?
Right.
But what I tend to find is the medications dull people, because I've had people work with me long-term and be on medications at first, and then them and their doctor decide that they're at a place where they can get off, and they do. And all of a sudden, like, meditation's vibrant and everything. They didn't even realize what they were missing out on because the medication was kind of capping their capacity to see and feel. I've also had people start doing shadow work, not on medication, experience a life trauma, step away, go on medication, come back and have it be a little bit more arduous. I've had everything in between. I've also had people do so much shadow work that they're able to get off medication. I've had people on all kinds of medications. And again, I'm not the person who decides this. They trust what they're feeling. They talk to their doctor. They come up with a plan with a medical professional, and they deal with that, because these meds are not something to fuck around with. Like, you can withdraw from some of these things. Like, be safe, guys, be really smart. But I've had people do enough shadow work. And again, it wasn't like 3 sessions. Like, they healed their trauma and got them, their nervous system, to a place where they felt really safe. They weaned themselves off of pain meds, whether it be not like oxy or things like that, but like, you know, like nerve pain, things like that, antidepressants, like things like that. They were able to literally taper off of those things with the help of their doctor, anti-anxiety meds, like benzos, stuff like that, like with their doctor, taper off. And then it was really interesting because their meditations got really vivid, but the foundation they laid while taking the medication was what provided the safety and the nervous system regulation for them to get off. But what was really interesting is they started to, and I say this because it's amazing, and it's also, people need to understand what these meds do. It expands your range, though, for emotions. And so when you've had something putting a glass ceiling and floor on your emotions, because if we don't want to experience depression, we're going to put a glass floor, but then you also cap the top. You cap extreme joy and passion and fulfillment. So it's kind of putting you in this narrow little path. When we take that glass floor away and you take the glass ceiling away, you can go both ways. So helping people understand that your moods may be a little bit more roller coastery for a little bit, because I've seen what happens when people come off of SSRIs. They typically cry a little bit more easy, and not in a bad way, but like they just feel so much more in meditation. They feel more in life. They're like a little bit happier. So like things can feel a little bit roller coastery for a little bit. And that's also part of the reason why I recommend, like, if, you know, however people feel about mainstream medicine, I have my own personal thoughts on it, as do, I'm sure, all of you guys. So work with whatever doctors you want, whether it's a holistic doctor or whatever, but have a medical professional help you, because if your mood starts to get a little roller coastery after you've tapered some meds, like, you probably also need some tangible, like, help, coping skills, whether it be therapy or whatever, to help you stay regulated, unless you're feeling really confident on your spiritual path. I've had some people navigate the extended peaks and valleys themselves with their guides and with you know, and then I've also had people continue to go to therapy, or, you know, things that kind of just like help them stay really grounded in the human 3D space, because we don't know what your body's going to be like if you've been on these meds for 5, 10, 15 years. You know, this is where I'm saying, like, we have to bridge the gap. As much as like witchy people, we just like love to just like be in the woods and not fucking participate in society. Like, if you've been indoctrinated into like big pharma for 15 years, it's going to take a little bit to like unravel yourself. And so I say that to just like help people manage their expectations, so that people are not thinking 3 shadow sessions and I'm off my antidepressants. Like, let's be safe, guys, you know?
Well, that shows you it really is going to take a team. And if you're in charge of your life and you're feeling like, okay, this is it, this is the next step that I want to take, how can we create the team that's going to get me to where I know this is going to help me and enable me to get to where I want to be?
Yes. And on that note, like, this is where we get to be sovereign. If you do not want to be on your meds and you set an intention to heal as much as possible to get off of them, you get to choose the doctors that help you do that. You get to choose doctors that feel aligned and safe, that advocate for you, that agree with you, that listen to you and what you're sharing. Because oftentimes what happens is, like, people don't want to get off meds because they're working with a doctor that are like, well, no, you need this. or like, well, no, you've been on this for forever. Like, this is just like,
you
get
people
to
are on this for life.
choose,
Yeah.
right? You get to choose the people that back you and make sure that the people you put on your team actually support you and believe in that vision that you have for yourself. Because there are incredible doctors and medical professionals out there that will advocate for you and will trust you and will believe you and will help you and will show you things that are aligned for your care path. It doesn't have to be what like the Matrix has indoctrinated you into, or however you got there.
Society,
that's not how it has
family.
to keep going. Exactly.
Oh my goodness, this is a lot to take in. This is why it's overwhelming. I think if you're going to do it the right way, it's doing it the right way, and it should be a little overwhelming. It's not going to be cute little hearts and stars in a journal that you're taking some random prompts on, or journal prompts on.
And here's the thing though, what I do want to speak on that is, yes, it is overwhelming, but I want everyone to understand that you are allowed to engage with it to whatever degree and whatever capacity you want. If you're someone that likes to dip a toe in the water and take a step back before you decide if you're going to jump in, that's okay. There are also people that rip the Band-Aid off and cannonball into a cold plunge. That's also okay. Like,
let's go.
So know yourself. If you are someone that dips a toe in 10 times before you stick your ankles in, then that's probably how you're going to be with this. And that's okay. If that's something that you don't like about yourself and you want to change it, shadow work will help you do that, but understand that you can engage with this. So like, I don't want people thinking that they can't take a shadow work masterclass one time because it's fucking pointless. Like, no, that's not the takeaway of this. Engage with this how you want. What I am saying is, if you want your life to be wildly, profoundly different, it will take consistency with shadow work. But if you want to test the water with one session or one masterclass or one recorded meditation or whatever, you want to DM me with a question, do it. Engage with this to whatever capacity you want, and trust yourself and your guides in the universe to carry you the rest of the way at whatever degree is necessary for you to move through this.
I think that's so well said. And thank you for putting it in those words, because hopefully I didn't come off the wrong way when I don't want to make fun of journal prompts or anything like that, because you know what, for somebody that might be exactly the path, right? To start with those little journal prompts and just to play around with some journaling and some writing. And then that's going to guide them to wherever they're supposed to be, because this is the path that they're on. And then
right. Exactly. And I think what I want to hammer home, and what you wanted to hammer home too, is like, that's not where we stop. Just because that's where you start, it's not where you stop. And we're hitting on that point so hard is because people do that and they start there and they stay there and then they wonder why nothing's working. It's because you're not continuing forward. But if that is your entry point, great. If your entry point is one masterclass or one shadow session or one whatever, and then you don't touch it for 6 months because you're like, I fucking don't have the capacity for this right now. That's okay. There's no shame, because I think that there's also like, it depends on how we energetically move. I have clients that are like, rip the fucking Band-Aid off. Let's do it.
Yeah.
And that's just like the potency of the way they move. But that's also usually been cultivated through a bunch of healing first. Nobody just like straight out of the gate like that, you know? Yeah. But then there's other people that like, we understand as a team collectively, me and said client, that their nervous system needs slow expansion, and they're probably going to need to take breaks, and they're probably going to need to really spend a lot of time integrating, and they're probably going to need to revisit something a couple times in their shadow. Like, and this is where there's no right or wrong way. I've had clients go back to the same life sometimes 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 times, like not necessarily consecutively, but I always say, like, if you were to in a future life get dropped into your current life and see 30 seconds of one life, like, that's not going to give you a good indication of what that was like, right? So like, there's really no right or wrong way. So I just want everyone to understand, don't create any stories about how good you are at this or your capacity of it, or like, whether it's for you or not, based on like 1 or 2 experiences, but engage with it how you want. Because I think there's a lot of shame when people are like, I can't just throw myself into this because of time or resources or my nervous system or whatever. Like, that's okay. Engage with it how you want. And I also am a huge fan of managing people's expectations, because I think that the internet promotes this false sense of like ease. Like, ease is not built on like, okay, one meditation and my dream life got dropped at my doorstep. Like, ease is built in the work that we do day in and day out to create that ease and that flow. And so I'm saying that because the wild experiences I personally had in my shadow that I share a lot on my podcast about, and I'm happy to elaborate upon any of these things that are like potentially cryptic for your audience, but the wild experiences I have had have come from deep, consistent shadow work over weeks, months, and years. And I don't say that to make it sound arduous. I say that because the way my life has shifted and the way my guides operate and the way I can manifest and call things into my life is not because I'm lucky. It's not because I'm better than anybody. It's not because I'm more ascended than anybody. It's because I'm doing the shit that most people don't do. And I'm making the time for it. And so it's, if you want that wild, profound change, understand it's going to be a journey. But if you're not ready for that, that's also okay. And there's no shame and there's no like rule book for how anyone has to engage with this. It's totally up to you. Because I think the internet also tells everyone that like someone else out there, whether it be a coach or a sky daddy or whatever the fuck, knows better than you know. You know what you need. And our ego sometimes doesn't, but your soul does. Your soul knows what is for you.
Right.
Listen to that.
And I think budgeting the right amount of time for it and committing to the process is, however that looks like for you personally, it's going to be different for everybody, whether it's weekly, whether it's daily, it's something, but committing to it and saying, this is it, I'm going forward, would be a first great step.
Yeah, for sure.
Kristen, this is amazing. Is there anything else, like a quick, hey, don't forget, please remember this, or anything like that with shadow work?
Yeah, you know what? So I actually want to wrap up with some tips if people want to try to do it by themselves. So what I will say from a safety standpoint, there are a couple things you do not want to try to do alone.
Okay.
I have been doing this for years, and there are still things that I will absolutely have someone hold space for. If it is something deeply fucking traumatic, or if it's something extremely malevolent, if you have uncovered that you have a parasitic entity attachment, a vampiric spirit attachment, you do not want to clear that stuff on your own, especially if you've never done it, because you risk agitating the spirit and creating backlash for yourself. And they also will disorient the fuck out of you if no one's holding space. And I say that to people, and sometimes they still try it. They're like, shit, you're right. That was a disaster. So like, there are things that you should absolutely not do on your own. But if you are someone that tries to do things on your own, if you're not really sure if working with a guide or whatever is for you, that's totally fine. I do recommend then trying to either find some guided meditations from practitioners that you trust, or if you want to do this on your own, getting yourself into a meditative state. And this can be done by listening to binaural beats. So binaural beats actually throw your brain into theta brainwaves because they're playing different sounds in each ear, which facilitate that process. And so what I recommend doing if you want to try shadow work on your own is setting an intention. Because what happens is if you've never done shadow work, your brain gets really overwhelmed, not really knowing what you're going to get dropped into. So do you want to meet your guides? Do you want to see a past life? Do you want to, whatever it is, you want to go into a chakra? And so when you're listening to those binaural beats, the first thing you want to do is make sure you're comfortable in a quiet place where you're not going to get distracted. So it's not the kind of thing you can do if your kids are like jumping on the couch next to you, or like wherever you are in your life, like you want to make sure you're somewhere quiet. So either laying down in your bed or sitting up on a couch, like comfortable, quiet, your eyes are closed for this process. You're listening to the binaural beats, recommend doing it with headphones because that's how those two sounds play differently. And you want to start by just focusing on your breath, because you want to really pull yourself into the present moment, breathing in through your nose, filling your lungs completely, and releasing everything fully with each exhale, just focusing on that breath. And if you're someone who can visualize, I recommend visualizing your chakras turning on, because we want to open up those pathways starting with the root. And I always send roots into the earth to make sure that people are really grounded in that process. And then from there, you can kind of let, what I always recommend is either calling the guides forward or traveling to meet the guides. So again, if you've never, ever done this, using a guided meditation to connect with your spirit guides, etc., can be a really powerful way to start. But you always want to have your guides first. You don't want to just be like traversing the astral plane or going into past lives without any guides, because that's how you run into entities and all kinds of problems. And so again, like if you were somebody who's never done this, I recommend having the structure of some kind of guided meditation. But connecting with your guides is a really great first step. Connecting with those guides, understanding who they are, so that then, because when you have that connection facilitated, you're going into meditation, you're calling your guides forward, or you're meeting them in, like, let's say the underworld or in a forest or wherever it is that you meet your guides, then they can share messages with you. You can start to build that trust and that safety. If you've never met your spirit team, I recommend asking, are you my guide? Are you here for my highest good? Because a spirit of either the divine light or the divine darkness, meaning underworld deities, beings that are safe and here for you, will always answer yes. If you get no answer, if you get a no, it's not a guide, it's potentially an entity. And so I say that because we want to be crystal clear in who or what we're talking to. Just because you have it in your head that you want to connect with like Hades or Lilith or whatever, doesn't mean that that being is going to show up. Something else can easily step in. And I don't say that to create fear. It's just to help people understand, because that's one of the biggest ways that people could kind of trip this up because you don't want an entity pretending to be a guide leading you through your shadow. That's going to go really bad, really fast.
Oh my God, I can't even.
So like connecting with the guides first, building that connection. And then from there, that's when they really start to take you into past lives and things. And what's really cool is when you start to build that trust and that connection, especially if you've done a lot of shadow work. Now, when I go in myself, there are times where I can close my eyes and like instantly be brought somewhere, or have the guides just really facilitate a lot for me if there's no one else holding that space. And so it's really powerful to watch how the gifts and the self-trust and how everything really just starts to flow when we've built that consistency. But I always say allowing the guides to be the first step. And then from there, that's when we can start to access like an unlock past life memories and things. It's shadow work changed my life in ways that are sometimes insanely difficult to put into words because of how profound it's been, which is why I love talking about it, because it's changed my life so much. It's changed the lives of my clients so much. Like, and to be able to live in the magic of doing this work every day is something that I'm like profoundly grateful for. So I hope that at least gives people a starting point.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing. And I think I feel the power with it too, even though I haven't done any of it. So that's why I'm trying to be so not specific, but purposeful with what I'm filling in my head with what shadow work is and the research before I jump in. I do feel like it will be life-changing. And I think it has that opportunity for anybody who truly utilizes it for what it can do.
I completely agree.
All right, Kristen, can you remind us again how we can find you one more time?
Yes. So if you guys have questions for me, you want to send messages or ask questions, I'm most active on Instagram. My handle is the Underworld Queen. I post a lot of, like, I do the most educational content there. I'm also on TikTok, but I am like super active on Instagram. So that's where you're going to reach me the fastest if you have questions. If you want to just kind of check out my content, I do a lot of teaching on Instagram. I also have a link to all of my programs and stuff on my website in the bio. So if you guys are like, I need structure around this, I have all that stuff there. I also have a podcast, Awaken the Witch. I talk, like I shared, I do a lot of teaching there. I also talk a lot about my personal journey and some of the wild shit that I've experienced. And I share that to kind of show people the level of magic and synchronicities that can occur if you stick with this path and trust it to bring you to the life of your highest good.
I have to say, I am going backwards on your podcast and starting from back in 2021. Is that when you started them?
Yeah, it was 2021.
Yeah. So I'm enjoying them thoroughly. It's a well done. Good
Thank
podcast.
You. I'm so glad that you're enjoying it. It's so much fun to be able to talk about that stuff. And that was actually a huge facet of my own witch wound healing. And that's, again, bringing back to the integration. It was like when I uncovered in my shadow that I was a witch and that my sole purpose was to do spiritual work, my first reaction was like, it was like a dichotomy between extreme excitement and a sheer terror. So I was like, fuck, like, I don't want to be visible doing that. And so like being able to speak my truth publicly and own, like, when anyone goes to my page, it's pretty taboo. It's all fucking dark and spooky and shit. Like, I was a chronic people pleaser that was obsessed with managing people's perception and reactions of me. And so that alone, like, I'm so proud of my podcast and the brand that I built, because that was not who I showed the world for a very, very long time. And I say that because it's easy to see the finished product or a polished version of someone and assume that it was easier, or that the path was clear, or that they've always been this way. Like, I was not that fucking deep down. I was that person, but absolutely not. There was a part of me. I had a panic attack when I put the word witch in my Instagram bio, and there wasn't even a spooky thing on that page. Like, the work that it took to feel safe in my body, showing up and talking about demons and all kinds of taboo shit on the internet, that was integration of the witch wound. Knew I was a witch, knew I had to do something about it, and worked every day to be able to build that safety to do that. So I'm very proud of that. And I share that because I want people to know that it's not just necessarily easier for other people. It's just as hard and scary, and to just trust those baby steps that you're taking in front of you.
That is perfect. And I think it's a perfect spot to wrap up today's podcast. I'm so thankful you were able to take time out of your day today to spend with us and walk us through this amazing, scary, amazing process of true, deep, dark shadow work and getting down into the dirt of our subconscious.
Yes. Thank you so much for having me. I had so much fun.
All right. Thank you. And I'll be right back with the listeners.
Thank you so much for joining me today, and a big, big thank you to Kristen for sharing all of her amazing knowledge and guidance on shadow work. I'm very honored to have this be the last episode of 2023's Witchy Work Wishes podcast, and I think it's a great thing to focus on as our calendar year wraps up. With that, I hope everybody has a great New Year's Eve. My first podcast in 2024 is all about drafting and creating our goals for the year. And I know for a fact, shadow work and starting the process is one for me. Till next week, till next year, my thoughts are with all of you. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I will talk with you again in 2024. Thank you for joining me today at Witchy Work Wishes, a place to find your weekly inspiration for bringing your personal witchcraft practice into your business, work, and office. For more information and additional content, please visit me online at witchyworkwishes.com. If you want to send me a personal note, please email me at info@witchyworkwishes.com. And of course, you can follow me on Instagram and Facebook. Just search for Witchy Work Wishes.